On this week's Talking Politics, the fallout from the growing Trump-Putin alliance.
We had a great call. It lasted almost 2 hours. Talked about a lot of things and toward getting it to peace.
You can't trust the players on this.
The question is, what does Starmer do as and when Trump may well say quite soon, here's the deal, take it or leave it?
The panic at the government's welfare reforms. We have been inundated with messages, literally hundreds and hundreds.
There are not just hundreds, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are going to be affected by this.
And is Rachel Reeves lost on the economy?
I don't think we need an emergency budget. I don't think we need a spring statement.
Welcome. I'm joined by Robert here in the studio and Anushka from Westminster, where, Anushka, I imagine, given you've been breaking a lot of stories about the government's welfare plans, you're not totally top of the popularity stakes in Downing Street right now.
No, not at the moment, I don't think.
Robert, let me just ask you first, because we're recording this just after listening to Prime Minister's questions, and it just occurred to me that Keir Starmer really looks like a man with his tail up a bit at the moment. You know, more confident, more polished. Fair or unfair?
Yeah, no, it's completely fair. He appears to be a bit like Gordon Brown was, very good in a crisis, not so good on sort of normal day-to-day prime ministerial juggling things. And he's had a bit like Gordon Brown had the financial crisis of 2008. He's had a pretty big crisis, dealing with a new American president who wants to be closer to Putin than any European leader thinks is remotely healthy. It's a pretty big crisis.
Anushka, what do you think? I find at the moment, and I don't know how you're both finding, but I find wherever I go at the moment, I sort of find basically two things, often in the same people: an obsessive desire to want to talk about the sort of collapsing world order and what it means, and an equally strong desire to run away somewhere really remote and never think about it again. But what do you think of, where Keir Starmer's at and his self-confidence at this point?
Well, I just think he's far, far more self-confident in the House of Commons and at the dispatch box, and you can see the gap between him and Kemi Badenoch because he's been doing it for years and years and years, and I just think he has got better and better. And actually not long ago I was watching back Keir Starmer 4 or 5 years ago in the chamber because he had changed his mind again about another policy that he used to argue for, and I thought I'd be interested in watching the difference between then and now. And it is remarkable how far he's come. He really sounded so loyally back then in the way he spoke. And actually he was struggling at the dispatch box, and that's obviously changed massively.
It's not to say that his, so-called newfound stature, because of the way he's handled himself on the international stage, is not without problems domestically. It is sort of staggering to me that he will not make any kind of explicit criticism of Donald Trump. And more than that, there are positions that the government are taking that, many would say are just straightforwardly wrong because of a risk of not wanting to stand up to Donald Trump. So we had this really striking thing of a foreign secretary saying in the House of Commons that the way that Israel was cutting off aid to Gaza was a war crime, and then literally 24 hours later rowing back, essentially saying potentially a war crime, and Downing Street refusing to describe what's going on as a war crime. And it's patently obvious that that is all about not alienating Donald Trump. But when people see the breaking of the ceasefire and children being killed in Gaza by Netanyahu's decision to resume the bombing, there will be millions of British people who just think the British government should be taking more of a stand on this.
It seems to me that Starmer's attitude to Trump is, we need to make ourselves independent of the Americans, can't rely on them, need to get closer to the Europeans, but we need 5 to 7 years to even begin to think about that, and we're just going to have to eat up, humble pie in the meantime. But we need to talk about the Trump-Putin phone call and the impact on Ukraine, because a lot of people will be wondering, are we going to have peace in Ukraine or not? What does it all mean? Let's just listen to Trump's own version, speaking to Fox News of that call.
We had a great call. It lasted almost 2 hours. talked about a lot of things and toward getting it to peace. And we talked about other things also.
Was there non-negotiables mentioned by Putin? It was reported that I think the Kremlin media actually stated that he demanded an immediate cessation of aid to Ukraine in order to get to this multi-step deal.
No, he didn't. We didn't talk about aid. Actually, we didn't talk about aid at all.
Also, in that Fox interview, Trump was pretty open. He's got good relationships with bad people, he more or less said, and not very good relationships with what America used to think of as its allies. But what do you both think of where we're really at this week and what it means for this changing world order?
What happened in that conversation between Trump and Putin actually brings us quite close to a crunch moment for the British Prime Minister, because there doesn't appear to be any basis for Zelensky and Kyiv to agree a ceasefire, let alone a peace deal with Moscow, not on the conditions that Putin is insisting on, including absolutely zero continued military support for Ukraine. Now, the position of Europe is very, very clear. The position of Keir Starmer is very clear. They all back Zelensky and Kyiv. The question is, what does Starmer do as and when Trump may well say quite soon, here's the deal, take it or leave it? Starmer will have to say, we're going to leave it. That looks to me to be potentially a big rift with America.
This phone call kind of really shows the risks for Keir Starmer in terms of being able to trust these players. I mean, obviously, within not much time after the call, Russia puts out a statement saying it's demanding that military aid stops for Ukraine. And yet Donald Trump says in the whole 2 hours, this wasn't mentioned at all, which makes you question what actually were they talking about? I mean, I think in that interview with Fox, he went on to talk about the rare earth that Russia has and the real estate opportunities. So obviously he's thinking American economy getting closer to the Russian economy. And moreover, you know, they didn't get the big ceasefire that they hoped for. Apparently Russia agreed to have a 30-day period in which neither side hit energy infrastructure, which has already been broken. So you can't trust the players on this. And so, like as Robert was saying there, it leaves Keir Starmer in a very difficult position, because even if he's playing a pretty good game of 4D chess at the moment, I actually do think maybe on international affairs, Downing Street are playing that game at the moment. It's one that could easily unravel at any moment.
I just want to ask you one question before we move on to welfare reform and talking about that. Obviously, we've seen how painful it has been, as you have documented, for the Labour Party to try and get 5 billion or whatever it is out of these welfare cuts. And when we're talking about defence and spending 3% or 4% or 5% of GDP, we talked last week or the week before about 5% would be in, you know, Estonia's just announced 5%. 5% for us is whatever it is, another 80 billion. Have you had any kind of further thoughts about what the trade-offs might be?
You can't cut, in my opinion, £80 billion and not leave yourself with a complete political nightmare. So your options are actually having a separate fund, long-term borrowing, saying this is wartime, we need to prepare for this, which probably there would be public support for, or something like a defence levy in which you say, look, here's a specific tax and it's going to be linked to our increased defence spending, which, by the way, they were going to do, remember, for the NHS and social care at a time where people were really worried about NHS and social care because of COVID. And it was incredibly popular to do that at the time. Although, you know, it may be even too much for taxes. And actually, I don't think they're open to doing that. I should say, at the moment, no one's talking about going to 5%. They're talking about going to 3%, which is more like £20 billion. And it feels like a kind of less galling total. We had some data recently on like what would you cut first, and the first one was international aid, which obviously they've cut. The second one was welfare, which obviously they've cut. The third one was net zero, which probably they'll cut. I don't know that. But the fourth one was actually defence. So you do have a group of people who really, really don't want to see more spending on defence.
If you can get the growth rate up, you know, if we're growing at 1% a year, you know, roughly at the moment, and that appears to be the basis of all sorts of structural changes to our economy, essentially our sort of new natural rate of growth. You can get it up to 2% a year. The amount of tax revenue that you just, you know, comes in just from your existing taxes is off the charts, right? So, but you need to put in place the conditions that allow you to invest not just in defense, but in all the other infrastructure and other projects, a bit like what's going on in Germany, which would persuade you that you can really significantly increase that growth rate. And the most important thing that ought to happen, I personally think it should have happened in 2008, 2009, after the financial crisis, but for all sorts of reasons it didn't, is you need an international agreement. You need to bring together, pretty much all of Europe has huge levels of debt. Japan has huge levels of debt. Throughout the rich world, there are huge levels of debt. If every major industrialized country came together and they all agreed to do something like, I don't know, turn 10, 20, 30-year debt into a 100-year debt, and at a reduced coupon, that means a reduced rate of interest, okay, essentially the financial burden for the entire developed world would be cut at a stroke. And it would not be possible for investors to punish any of us because we would all be doing the same thing together. We can't write down our debt on our own because we will immediately become the target for hedge funds and other investors who will sell sterling, sell our debt, and that way leads essentially the bankruptcy of a nation. But if all countries come together and say debt is unaffordable in these new times, let's restructure that, then at that point, I'm afraid the world's investors just have to suck it up.
We have been inundated with messages, literally hundreds and hundreds from viewers and listeners after the reforms on welfare were announced. This gives you a flavour. This government has no idea what it is like living with a disability. It's hard enough coping every day being in pain with so many ailments. How am I supposed to get a job when a majority of my time is spent in the doctor's surgery having regular blood tests and other checkups? I cannot believe this government wants to take support away from the most vulnerable. It's cruel. PIP is a very hard benefit to apply for. It's unbelievable they want to make it harder still. And Anushka did an interview with Liz Kendall, and let's just take a quick listen to that.
Do you not know how many people will be affected?
You will have to wait till you see the OBR and its view and its assessment of these proposals. But let me say this, our objective of this is to fix a failing system. It's not working for anyone. It's not working for the people who want to work but aren't getting the support. And the truth is, unless we get a more sustainable social security system, it's not going to be there for the people who genuinely need it.
Some might think it's a very busy news day, the spring statement. Are you trying to bury
absolutely
the
not.
bad news?
Absolutely.
Is it because it shows too many people are going to be pushed into poverty?
Absolutely not.
Well, there are two issues really there. There's the question of the benefit reforms, where we are, how the government's thinking, and what happens next, and what the impact will be. But there's also the spring statement, which I don't know whether we're allowed to call an emergency budget or not. So maybe let's wrap this discussion up by combining those two things. Anushka, you first. Where do you think the government is right now about the impact of this?
Well, I think there is quite a lot of backlash across the party. It's slightly eased off because they dropped the thing that was most worrying Labour MPs, which was the idea of freezing personal independence payments next year so they don't rise in line with inflation. I think the reality is that taking £5 billion out of PIP, which is what they're going to do by increasing the eligibility threshold, is still going to hit loads of people. She obviously wouldn't tell me how many, which I find astonishing when they've literally done an impact assessment. They know how many people it hits, but they say we have to wait until the Office for Budget Responsibility has looked at their sums before they're going to bring it out on, as I made clear there, a very busy news day, although we will very much stay on how many people it hits. But the Resolution Foundation think it's between 800,000 and 1.2 million people. And, you know, the public are quite on board with some of these reforms. I was looking at some more in common polling yesterday, which, you know, do you remember Liz Kendall actually said to me in an interview a while back that some people are taking the mickey on benefits? Quite a lot of people agree with that, right? If you look at the polling, and quite a lot of people would like to see benefits made harder to get. But that is the sort of like bigger macro argument that you can make. The reality is what you've seen in all those letters that you've got, Tom, which is there are not just hundreds, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are going to be affected by this, who are really disabled, very vulnerable, and who are going to be absolutely bombarding their MPs. You know, yesterday I spoke to a guy, Murray, who has epilepsy. You couldn't tell he was disabled to meet him, but he showed me like video footage on his Ring doorbell of him having a fit suddenly. He's 3 times nearly walked off a train platform and had to be stopped by other customers, so can't really travel on his own. And he was on ITV News, on Evening News yesterday, and then before 10 o'clock news, his MP had got in touch with him, because they're hearing these heartbreaking stories and they're thinking, what can we do about it? And trying to say to him, we're going to put loads of money into epilepsy research, to which Murray replied on the same evening saying, that's not what I want. What I want is to be able to keep my benefits. And also the point you also made, which is we've been investigating PIP for years. It is a really onerous and difficult thing to go through, and people find it very difficult. But clearly the government has made a decision that particularly a lot of people with psychiatric conditions are getting it when they don't need it, and so they're going to make it harder to get. But like, you know, I had senior Labour MPs messaging me saying, do we really think 1 million people on PIP don't deserve it?
Why are people calling the spring statement an emergency budget, and why do we need an emergency budget?
I don't think we need an emergency budget. I don't think we need a spring statement. I think, you know, actually what we are seeing at the moment is what's frankly wrong with the way Starmer and Reeves are making decisions. You know, it is the case that the OBR, I think that the first piece of legislation that Rachel Reeves pushed through Parliament, I personally think it was balmy, was to increase the power of the Office for Budget Responsibility, because she wanted to prove to the world that there's no chance that Labour would ever do a Liz Truss. I'm assuming that it is in that legislation which says there have to be 2 Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts a year. Okay, you could argue that if you want to keep the government on the straight and narrow, let's hear from the official forecaster twice a year. But the idea that outside of a budget, that forecast would be shaping government policy to the extent that it is, seems to me to be absolutely crazy. Obviously, with the bill for disability, what used to be called incapacity, increasing at the rate that it is increasing, there, you know, it's sensible for any government to look at why, you know, what is driving this surge in costs to, you know, what is it, 70 billion by 2029, which is an enormous amount of money. Obviously, any government would want to look at, you know, why that bill is increasing, what can be done to, you know, make sure that money is being properly distributed, try and slow it down if you possibly can. All very sensible stuff, but not with an artificial bloody deadline of, you know, March the 26th, because, you know, that's when you want to prove that you're not going to breach your fiscal rules in order to bring that bill down and simultaneously do what the government says it wants to do, which is to create a lot more fulfilling work for people who are currently writing themselves off. An enormous amount of other stuff has to happen. You've got to change the attitudes of employers. You've got to, you know, basically increase mental health provision. None of that is happening before March the 26th. All that's happening is the money's being taken away. And I just think that's mad.
It is literally a green paper, which is supposed to be a consultation. You wouldn't normally expect it to be scored for a fiscal event when it is a consultation. It makes it, you know, obviously a sham that it's a consultation because it's actually happening. Just on the OBR, it is hilarious talking to people in the Treasury who were so like, we are going to respect the Office for Budget Responsibility. They can't stand it already because the OBR won't tell them what they want to hear on economic growth. And one of the reasons why Liz Kendall was so unwilling to tell me what the numbers were yesterday, although she did say there's this 5 billion net saving, is because They don't know that the OBR is going to accept it. That, you know, the OBR could look at their employment support plans and say, hang on, when the Tories did similar employment support plans, they didn't drive people back into work. And in fact, it was the OBR's assessment of the Conservatives' welfare reforms which led to them being challenged in court and being found unlawful, because the OBR said, hang on, these reforms are going to get loads of people losing money and hardly anyone into work. And that is why there is a nervousness around it.
Okay, we probably need to leave it there. So that's all for now. Thanks for all the messages you've been sending us and talking politics at itv.com. Plenty of you have been sending in your questions too. So we'll be bringing you some answers in our Q&A episode on Friday. Until then, have a great week.